Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike St. Pierre. I'm located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and have the pleasure of hosting Colonel Grant Newsham this afternoon. His topic will be Asia's first island chain, links of steel or Gossamer. If you're not familiar with the Mackinder Forum, I suggest you do if this is your only first one. But for those returning, everything is tied in with the Chatham House rules, so non-attribution to the speaker, and we keep that close hold. That largely applies to the Q&A. Grant, I wish we were meeting again for noodles in Taipei, but today I'll have to settle for what looks to be an interesting talk. So Colonel Grant Newsham is a retired U.S. Marine and the first U.S. Marine advisor to the JSDF. He played a key role in establishing Japan's amphibious force. Grant also served as the Reserve G2 Intelligence and G5 Plans and Policy at Marine Forces Pacific Headquarters in Honolulu. He lived in Japan for 25 years and was an executive at Morgan Stanley, Japan, and Motorola, Japan. He's also a former U.S. diplomat. I would also highly suggest picking up his book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America, which was a bestseller. Grant, over to you, and look forward to this.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. For every now and then, I get interviewed a lot, and every now and then I'll get on one of the big stations' morning shows, and it'll have. I'm always worried that I'm speaking to about 5 million sullen New Yorkers who've just woken up, but for some reason I'm about as tense with this one. I don't know exactly why it is, but I'll get started. And I'm going to really just run through, give you my take on things, and I've spent about 40 plus years in the region and looking at it. And as you can see from the background, I've done a few different things. I keep getting fired, or I have a short attention span. But I was obviously with the Marines, the State Department, investment bank, a high-tech company, etc. So you tend to look at the issues from, as I say, multiple directions. And now this appeared in the recent National Defense Strategy, and you can see what it lays out. And this is what the Trump administration has said, that they were awfully nice to China in the language they used, but they were very clear that it was that first island chain that they were going to defend against. And the word gets used so often that a lot of us just assume everybody knows what it is. But what it is, of course, is if you look at the map, it's a chain of islands going from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines, and then down to Malaysia, Indonesia, Borneo, that area. It serves as a chain that blocks China's easy access to the Pacific. And if you go to the next slide, please. That's just to orient. Maps are great for understanding this, but so next slide. And here you can see it's that purple line that lays out roughly where the first island chain is. It usually starts up at Japan, but in this case it stretches all the way to the Aleutian Islands. And there's a second island chain, of course, and a third island chain, but we're just talking about the first one mostly here. Next slide. And this slip map is a little better, that lays it out a little more clearly, but it gets it about right. And it's very clear. Now, I remember probably 20 years ago in Japan, that I remember going to the Japan Defense Headquarters, and in the offices of the officers, you would see this map that you'd never seen before, because you didn't quite know what it was. It was skewed. It was sort of off kilter. And eventually I figured out that what it was is the next slide. It was basically a picture. It was a map that was looking outward from the Chinese mainland. And you could see at that point, you could see Japan, then down to the right, the Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, and then down to the Philippines, and then Borneo off to the right. And I would say that map probably told me more about Chinese strategic thinking than any of the 10 million words and umpteen things that I've read about China. I mean, looking at that, you could understand the Chinese perspective about things. Now, next map. Next slide, please. And this is just a different angle, but you can really see how the Chinese will look at this. And they see this barrier. And the challenge, of course, is to get through the barrier. And that's what that is their strategic objective. And geography is the thing that if you just understand this, you can get a good sense of, there's more to it, but of how China looks at the region. So what I'm going to do now is I want to just walk down the chain and give my take on just how solid, or what the sort of the strength of it is, and each of the parts of it as well, going from Japan all the way down to Indonesia as well. And just starting off with Japan, in terms of its military capabilities, defense capabilities, it's got a it's there's a tendency to think, because it's Japan, it must be really good. They must have a wonderful military, and they've got things in order, and they're just going to get stronger, and that's that. And the Japanese military does have some very good niche capabilities. It's particularly in anti-submarine warfare, maritime patrol, surface warfare is pretty good as well. Outer space, it's very good, and its intelligence, its surveillance, and maritime surveillance in particular is quite good. But you'll notice I haven't mentioned a whole lot else. But there's a niche capabilities. But what you would hear, and I was involved in this for a lot, is you would hear American diplomats always saying the relationship is rock solid. I would say it's never been stronger. And what you would see as well, it was actually funny, is you would see the the Marines, for example, and the Japanese army would exercise, and they would each do their own thing, and then at the end there would be a barbecue party, and the Marine generals would always say, "Oh, my friend Suzuki's a warrior," and Suzuki's looking at him thinking, you know, I wish I was, but I don't have the chance. And he's kind of thinking, what kind of an idiot are you? But the Americans would talk it up, and without looking at the reality of the Japanese military and the problems that it had. And you can see why I don't get invited to many places, or at least not invited back. But that was the way it was until fairly recently, actually. And the thinking was, on the American side was, well, we'll take care of things. Just let the big boys, you go take care of it. You guys go sit in the corner. So it really wasn't until maybe a decade ago that started to change. The Air Force, the Air Forces get along pretty well, because just the nature of it. And the Japanese Army and the U.S. Army, they had this relationship where the Japanese Army was all set. If the Russians had invaded Hokkaido, it was basically a concept of operations that you'd have found in Western Europe. And so there was something called the Hokkaido Mafia, which was the tank officers in the Japanese army, who were the cool guys. And they had over 1,000 tanks waiting for the Russians to land in Hokkaido for many years. And then about 10, 12 years ago, that started to change. They sort of figured out. Now, the two navies actually do get along very well. And I think part of the reason there is that early on, Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was commanding in Japan, he told his staff, look, we're going to treat them like equals, treat them like our friends. And despite the fact that they just fought a war, and that could really set the tone. So the two navies actually have a pretty good relationship. But in terms of the Japanese military's overall capabilities, it has had some very weak, some problems, and it still has a lot of them. But the country has woken up in the last 5 years to the idea that China is out to get them, and they've got to do something about it. And it's very interesting that you see Japan doing things defense-wise, talking about things defense-wise, particularly when it comes to overseas dealings with other militaries. That just couldn't have happened 5 years ago, maybe 10. Couldn't have happened. And as one of my friends said, well, like the Japanese always do, they forget what they were complaining about. But there has been a reawakening. And you'll sometimes hear the expression, well, the Japanese are rearming. And the Chinese say this all the time. But the Japanese rearmed in about 1960, or by then. But so they've always had a real military. It just hasn't been able to do what a military should do. but it's had military. So it's really just strengthening what it already has. And that's the better way to look at it. But here's the point here. Japan's military is not ready to fight a war. It's about that simple. It's operationally, it can't do it. It still finds it very difficult to do joint operations, combine the services together. Uh, they're getting better at it, and they know they need to do it, and they've recognized that 10 years ago. But it's taking them a while. They still have so the parts. It's less than the sum of its parts, even still. Doesn't have all the hardware that it needs. That, for example, the Navy's probably half the size it should be. Same with the Air Force to do all of it, all the things that it needs to do. A couple of years ago, the Navy was having so much trouble finding recruits that they were talking about in order to man two Aegis destroyers the Japanese were going to buy. They were talking about taking 500 people in the Japanese army and press ganging them into manning the ships, becoming sailors. It didn't go anywhere, but that's what they were talking about. Combat logistics, there's got a ways to go on that. Casualty handling, and casualty replacements. That hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves. War stocks, they don't have what they need. In fact, for a long time, say just one example, say with the Patriot missile systems, they bought those, but they did the equivalent of buying, if you get a toy at Christmas and it comes with these two tiny little batteries that last about 15 minutes. They had bought Patriot systems, but with just enough missiles to shoot once. And the idea was if you needed more, well, we'll get them from the Americans. And that was the thinking for a long time. They've pretty much woken up. Their reserve system is a mess. And you don't get much out of it. So people may not believe what I'm saying, but there's the truth teller here is recruitment. The JSDF, the Japanese military, misses its recruitment targets by about 20 to 25% every year. And a couple of years ago, they missed it by 50%. And that tells you something. It's hard to say that this is really a healthy military if you can't attract enough people in it. And as I said, the Navy and the Air Force are probably half the size they need to be. But at the same time, it's a really professional force. It's good at what it does, and the people in it want to be there. And they don't have things like a GI Bill, and their housing is terrible. They don't really have pensions, and yet they join. So I would call these people really patriots, but they don't say they don't have enough of them, and they have not figured out that what you've got to do is give them some respect. And you'd hear for many years, you would hear Japan's elite just berate and belittle, humiliate the Japanese military. And that had an effect on really handcuffed their ability to get any better. And it was not a good situation. In fact, I've spoken about the Japanese military a few now and then to Japanese groups. And one of the questions I would get asked more than once was, well, isn't it true that in order to join the military in Japan, you have to actually be a Yakuza? Like to be a gangster? And you would hear that. And these were Japanese people asking me that. And you find very often the Japanese people haven't ever met anyone in the military. Just the other day, and I mean like 2 days ago, a lady in a diet member, said publicly that she was actually berating the defense minister and saying, well, only poor people join the military. And I think to Japan's credit, the response, and I've added to it on social media, has been fierce at the idea that she would say something like that. And one, it's not true, but it reflects the belittling sort of approach to the Japanese military that too much of Japan's ruling class has had for too long. That's starting to change, though, but you can see it's 2026 now. It's taken a while to get around to that. And meanwhile, the Chinese have been coming. And also there's been a tendency to sort of focus on high-priced objects. So these shiny objects, that high-tech systems or advanced systems, and think if you buy those, that will be enough to scare off any enemies that you've got. Also, this idea of magic weapons. You first saw this, that I noticed it was in the Gulf War, the first one. where you saw the laser guided bombs. And Japanese people started to think, well, if we have laser guided bombs because they hit what you aim at, if we get those, then there's no need to have anything else. So there hasn't been all that much clear thinking at the top, at the levels where decision or guidance is given. Although within the military, there's been people who've known that and have tried to do the best they could to move things along. And they did have some success because it's not didn't happen by accident that now you have in the JSDF, you have the basis of a pretty good military if you just do a few things right. And there's always been something I want to mention when it comes to Japan. Always been a big difference between the public and the Nagata-cho. Nagata-cho is their Capitol Hill. And the public has always been very supportive of military things when it's explained to them. When someone tells them, does Japan need a military? Is China a threat? And the answer there has always been about 90%. Well, yeah. And yet in the ruling class, I think you would find, say in the legislature, maybe about 40% might think that. And what I'm getting at here is that and there's an aspect here that doesn't get the attention it deserves, but it's well known in some quarters, and that is very successful Chinese subversion, political warfare of Japan's political class. It's a lot of its business class, not that that's hard, but in the political class, it is very interesting, the effectiveness they've had. And that has reflected itself in, I'd say, Japanese defense policies for many years. Just one example, I was at an event, and this wasn't all that long ago. It was maybe less than 10 years ago. And there was a gentleman there. I was told he's he's very influential in the Liberal Democratic Party. And he was actually part of a think tank that I know very well. And people were lined up at this event really to kind of kiss his ring because he was so influential, not least in defense policy. It was an event about defense matters. And not long after that, I was at an event, and much smaller event with a small group, and he was saying things that really made you think that he wasn't all that serious about defending Japan. Saying that didn't really face any threats, et cetera, et cetera. The Americans will take care of things. And then not long after that, somebody showed me a list of people that they regarded as, well, Chinese agents or Chinese agents of influence. And this guy's name was on it. It sounds, it's hard to believe, but it didn't surprise me. And, more recently, there was a fellow, it was one of the very recent prime ministers, and he had a defense advisor who would actually come to Washington. And this guy used to be really good on the threats facing Japan. And some people told me that, well, a few years ago, he started driving expensive cars. And he started working for an outfit that they were very suspicious of. And they went and talked to him and they said, don't you know that this is a Chinese thing you're involved with? And he says, yeah, I know, I don't care. And that's a problem that the Japanese have to deal with. And I think it has slowed down their progress, taking defense seriously. And there's plenty of other examples that I won't get into because this is being taped. But one of the weaknesses when it comes to Japan is it's kind of interesting, is the pathologic dependence that built up over the years by relying too heavily on the United States. And that is another reason why the Japanese military grew up. It developed in kind of a stunted fashion and didn't turn into a sort of a properly balanced military. And it was literally pathologic dependence. This was a while back. I was talking to a Japanese diplomat, and I told him, look, you guys are going to have to do more if you expect us to defend you. And he says, what would an American know about what Americans think? And he just looked at me, he almost stuck his tongue out, and he said, Ampo Joyaku, which means defense treaty. And he was basically saying that the US-Japan Defense Treaty is like a contract that obligates the Americans to go die for Japan. And that was the thinking, actually, in a lot of, say, Japan's ruling class. And you'll often hear as well, there's the Constitution won't let Japan do something or other. When you'd push to have them do more militarily, to improve themselves in a certain way, what you would hear was Kempo, Constitution, won't let us do it. But when you'll hear that excuse all the time, and really what it means is that it's like a get out of jail free card in Monopoly. The Japanese use that very effectively against the Americans to get out, to avoid doing anything they don't want to do. You heard it recently when the Japanese didn't want to send ships to anything to the Persian Gulf to help the Americans. Well, one of the excuses you heard was the Constitution won't let us. Well, the Constitution is very clear about things, and it has been reinterpreted and reinterpreted out of any connection to its original meaning a long time ago. If Japan needs to do something, feels like it needs to do it, it always does it and just reinterprets the Constitution that way. You'll also hear reasons why the Japanese don't have a strong enough defense is because they don't have enough money. And you'd hear it all the time. We have a severe fiscal condition. Well, Japan has all the money for whatever it needs to do, just like we do. We went bust a long time ago, but our credit cards still work, and the same goes with Japan. So that's not much of an excuse. The other part here is that you often hear, well, the rest of Asia doesn't want Japan to have a strong military. And the Chinese say that all the time. But if you actually go throughout Asia, you keep score, it's very different. You'll find, of course, in Korea, there's a lot of animosity, and a lot of that is also stoked for political purposes. And the Chinese, of course, they play that for all it's worth. It's not entirely unfounded. But if you go down the rest of Asia, Japan is very well liked. Taiwan, very good relations. In fact, Taiwan would love Japan to do more militarily. The Philippines, very good relationship. And that's probably Japan's strongest defense relationship in the region with the Philippines. Vietnam, good ties by and large. The Vietnamese and the Indonesians see the Japanese as having helped them throw off the colonial yoke. Singapore, just recently, the Prime Minister of Singapore said that Singapore and ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, actually welcome Japan to play a much bigger role, including a security role in the region. Malaysia, well, they're sort of playing both sides, a little closer to the Chinese than they should be, particularly when it comes to the pocketbook. But Japan has a decent relationship. The Australians are letting bygones be bygones. And they've got a good tie-up, particularly including defense-wise, with the Japanese and the Indians. That's probably the strongest relationship of all, and that's 1+ billion people who think the Japanese and the Japanese military and a Japan playing a bigger military role is actually a good thing to have. So that is, say, it's part of the equation, and it's worth remembering. So what Japan has been doing, I've said it's got some problems, and it does. But at the same time, it's actually doing more than it has ever done. And it is doing it despite the fact that China's going to complain. It always does. It's talking you can't open a Chinese paper these days without seeing some sort of warning about Japanese militarism. And nobody much buys it, but that you hear it all the time. And the Japanese are buying, they're figuring out joint operations. They just set up basically a joint command headquarters a year or two ago. It's got a ways to go, but they understand it, and they are buying a lot of missiles, trying to get the war stocks problems right, and they're actually doing things like selling drones to Ukraine. They've got Japanese companies there helping the Ukrainians with drones as well, and as I say, they're doing things they've never done before. They know they have got a problem, and they are trying to get things right, to defend themselves, and they want the Americans to actually get closer to them. They understand pretty well that without the Americans, that they wouldn't have wouldn't have very good prospects at all. Uh, but they are say they're trying to set up relationships with just about everybody or everyone they can. And that never would have happened 5, 10 years ago. So as much as anything, there's been a huge psychological shift in Japan when it comes to their own defense. But they are suffering from having waited too long to actually do what was necessary. I'd say they probably wasted 40 years. They're probably, I'd say, 10, 15 years too late. Or it'd have been better if they started sooner than they have. Now, if you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, we're gonna move down the chain. Next slide. Okay, we're going to move down from Japan. And in between Taiwan and, actually, it's worth remembering, in between Taiwan and Japan, the mainland or the main islands, there's the Ryukyu Islands where Okinawa is. And that's the Nansei Shoto in Japanese. And that is, from the Chinese look at it, they see a barrier. And they also say it's properly Chinese territory. And the Japanese, of course, look at it differently. And they see it as really as the Japanese territory to be defended and to make it as difficult as possible for the Chinese to get through it. And the Japanese actually first came up with a plan that I saw in the late 2000s for actually fortifying the Ryukyu Islands, the Nansei Shoto, and they did it very quietly, and it sort of happened like a subterranean lava flow. And so the point of that is they've been thinking about it for a long time. And now they have put bases down there, surveillance posts, and also anti-ship missile, anti-aircraft positions as well. And they plan to do more. And they're training with the Americans down there as well. It would be nice if it was a joint defense, but maybe that'll come someday. But let's move on to Taiwan. And first I want to talk about why it's important. Because you'll hear a lot these days. Well, it's just some islands, a rock actually, 6,000, a long way from the U.S., 90 miles, 100 miles from the Chinese mainland. Why should we defend it? Well, there's a few things that you should think of, and one is that if you look at it from a military perspective, that if you take Taiwan, say it falls, and it comes under Chinese control, at that point, you've done the equivalent of breaching a castle wall. You've broken the chain. And from there, the People's Liberation Army swings north and it isolates Japan, swing to the south, and you can cut Australia off and move to the east, and you have free access to the Pacific and all the way to the west coast of Latin America, which is what the Chinese objectives are. So it's very useful from just a military perspective. That would be breaking the first island chain. And there's more to it than that that's worth keeping in mind when you think of Taiwan and its importance. And that is the political psychological effects of Taiwan going under. And that would be that it would be demonstrating that US military power couldn't keep 23 million people of Taiwanese free, that US economic and financial pressure on China couldn't stop the Chinese, and US nuclear weapons couldn't either. And at that point, everyone who's been implicitly relying or explicitly relying on US protection is going to have second thoughts. And you're going to find that Asia turns at least a dark pink almost overnight as everybody cuts the best deal they can. I think the chips are actually that would just be from the Chinese perspective, gravy. And also there's an aspect that from the Chinese perspective that Taiwan is a rebuttal of the Chinese argument that Chinese people or Chinese or originated people can only be ruled with a boot on the neck. Jackie Chan agrees with that, but Taiwanese don't. And you look at Taiwan and you have a free China or a free place 90 miles off of the Chinese mainland. And it's an example really of what China could be. And that is something that the Chinese Communist Party and its leaders don't like. So those are some reasons. Say that is the short version of why it's so important. Now, when it comes to Taiwan defending itself, it'd often be nice if the Taiwanese were Ukrainians, but I'm not Sure, they are just different characters, but we wasted a lot of time when it came to defending Taiwan and having Taiwan defend itself. In fact, you would go to a Taiwan Marine base, for example, say 10 years ago, and you felt like you were back at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina in 1978. It looked like it in every respect. The Marines looked like it. And the Taiwanese military, because it was isolated by the Americans in particular, and didn't have any dealings really with anyone much, it was like it had been set in amber. It was like a fossil, and it hadn't developed the way a military should have. And that set them back. So instead of being sort of a tough, having, it progressed to the point you become a really tough nut to crack and can look after yourselves, they were like pretty much stuck in 40 years ago. And that's the reality of it. They have many of the same problems the Japanese military has, and when it comes to lack of funding, lack of respect, and they've had a really and using their reserves properly. You hear, well, Taiwan's got 1 million or 2 reservists. Well, most of those have had almost no training in recent memory. Maybe every year you might get 8% or so that get like a week's training. So the reserve system is not anywhere near what it should be. It's sort of shambolic. And they went to an all-volunteer force around 2000, little after 2010. And I remember when they did that, they were actually asking the Marines, they were asking us, well, what slogans do you use to attract people? Because, the Marines are famous for being able to, sort of swindle, couldn't get people to join the Marines. And they thought we had some magic, incantation that would attract recruits. So they never figured out that maybe if you pay people better and give them housing and pensions and benefits, that they will join. So they've never quite gotten that, but they've dumped the all volunteer force idea and are starting to conscript more than they have. But they've lost a lot of time. That's a good way to put it. And they didn't get the help that the Americans could have given them. And one example of this that I like to cite is that this was 2012 or so, that the Taiwanese showed us their Stinger missiles. And the Stinger is it's a shoulder fired weapon. The Afghans used it against the Russians. You can carry it up and over hills, etc. But their Stingers were actually set into concrete blocks. And they were operated from like a fix. That was it. And the reason they did that is because the Americans required them to do that as the price of getting the things. And that was the State Department, thank you very much, not wanting to offend China. And think of that, the Stinger missile that's stuck on a pole in a concrete block. And extrapolate from that, and you get a sense of just how Taiwan's ability to defend itself was, in some respects, sort of strangled, with the US side deserving a lot of blame for that. And in some quarters of the US State Department, in particular, not only there, but other agencies joined in as well. The idea was that, well, Taiwan's a dispensable irritant in the much broader relationship with the Chinese. And there's less of that thinking now. And there has been some good progress on that front in breaking the isolation. And that, for example, you'll now have like battalion-sized Taiwanese army units training with the National Guard in Michigan. And that is a big deal. The Chinese Air Force has had a training squadron in the Western US for a long time, but sending the ground troops there is a big thing. And you've also got a lot more American advisors than you've ever had in Taiwan. And it's a pretty big number. It's not huge, but it's a lot bigger than the less than 100 that they used to have. And they're doing more than just sort of teaching them, how to clear a room or how, combat shooting, etc. But rather, you get glimpses of it every once in a while. But say when the Taiwanese announce that they have, say, approach to controlling fire support, sort of a joint fires center that's going to coordinate the defense of Japan, of Taiwan. That idea didn't come from leprechauns. You can see the hand of some good American, some thought going into that. And so there, it's been late in it's been very late getting started, but the Taiwanese are, I think, doing better. And I think if you look at it from a Chinese perspective, I doubt they're very happy with what they are saying in terms of improvements in Taiwan's defense capabilities. I think they thought that part of the chain looked pretty good in terms of their prospects, and now I think they're grumbling about it a bit. But there's also a psychological aspect to Taiwan's defense, and that is, if people don't feel like they don't have any friends, and especially if they face a sort of powerful bully who wants to enslave them or kill them, well, over time you get worn down, and it's difficult. And you used to see some of that in Taiwan now and then, maybe more of it than I think. But once again, the more people, the more they think they have support, the more likely they are to actually defend themselves. But Chinese subversion and political warfare in Taiwan has been a decades-long effort. It's been very effective, actually. And you're seeing the results of this most recently, for example, when the president of the KMT, the Kuomintang, the main opposition party, which unfortunately controls the legislature in Taiwan, she was in Beijing not long ago, really kowtowing to Xi Jinping. And most recently, she was in Washington, D.C., basically saying things that sounded like the Chinese Communist Party told her to say. And it's not an inconsequential group, and it just might win a future presidential election. And I think that is something the Chinese are casting some of their bets on. But this Chinese subversion in Taiwan and the cognitive warfare is considerable. And it's been going on a long time. It's been a real challenge for the Taiwanese to deal with. And it seems like almost every week they announce having caught some spy. And very often these are people in the Taiwanese military, officers, no less, usually retired. And that is, you kind of have to think, well, that's tip of the iceberg. The question that you hear debated endlessly is, could China take Taiwan? I think they probably think they could have a reasonable chance of taking Taiwan if they had a mind, if they had a mind to. They spent 50 years putting together a military to do just that, with a combination of airborne, amphibious, a very heavy rocket attack. They've had a long time for the targeting, naval blockades, and air dominance, etc. They just might think that they could do it. But they've also had a fifth column that they've set up for a long time. And there's part of it is centered on Taiwanese organized crime that is very closely related to Chinese organized crime, which is an arm of the Chinese government. So there is the possibility that they could think they could get across quickly, get across the strait, and take the place. Or if they get there, if they do it right politically, you could get your person in the Blue House or in the presidency, and just sort of roll over. That's not unthinkable. But unfortunately, I think we have reached the point where the Chinese aren't thinking, well, we need another decade. I think they just might have Xi Jinping just might have a sense that sometime it's worth rolling the dice. And he told President Biden that as much in San Francisco a couple of years ago, saying that all this talk is about peaceful resolution is good, but we're not going to wait forever. So militarily, you'll hear the debate goes on. It's sort of like, could the New York Yankees beat the LA Dodgers? You can argue it to no end, and people do. But from my perspective, that they have built up a military that needs to be taken very seriously. One of the good news is the Taiwanese do recognize this, and they're getting more help than they've ever gotten. And the idea is to turn it into a porcupine that is just too much trouble for the Chinese to deal with. And I've used the expression, it'd be helpful if it was a combination of, say, Switzerland and Hezbollah, where you have a very well-armed, trained population willing to fight, And then the Hezbollah line, what I'm getting at is in 2005, when the Israelis went into Lebanon and they were getting hit by precision, by long range, by missiles, and they couldn't see where they were. And Taiwan is the same dynamic, that if you can crack ships in half 90 miles across the strait, that it makes for a very long afternoon for the Chinese, for the PLA. Same with air defense as well. And so the Taiwanese are getting things like the HIMARS systems, that's very useful in a even an anti-ship role. They've got their own long-range missiles, anti-ship and otherwise, and they drones. They're getting better at it. They know they need a ton of them and never have enough. Smart mines as well. So they're getting advice on how to make it a very tough nut to crack. It is unfortunate that recently the KMT, the opposition party, cut from the proposed defense budget, really the funding for more of a domestic drone production capability, which is something that made the Chinese very happy. But at the end of the day, when it comes to Taiwan's defense and keeping the first island chain intact, or that piece of it, it's really a question of American will. Are the Americans willing to defend Taiwan? And the Chinese watch that very, very closely. So that's moving down the chain. Next slide, please. And this just gives you a sense of what the Chinese have lined up within range of Taiwan. You don't have to read the specifics. Next slide. And this is actually from a year and a half ago, and the Chinese now it covers the whole. It goes all around the island, but the Chinese are when they say that they're just might go after it, they're very serious about that. Next slide. Okay, and the Chinese have studied World War II, and they very interested. So they look at Taiwan as really just a stepping stone. It's not as if if that'll be enough for them. That would just be the first step. Next slide. And it goes all the way, as I said, to the West Coast, to Latin America. And the idea is that the PLA someday, if it goes right, will be operating from there. They've been obviously building ports, getting interest in ports throughout Latin America. And once again, it's done partly for economic and influence reasons, but there's always a sort of a military angle, and they're willing to wait, take their time. So we'll just leave this one up, please. And now move on to the Philippines. We're having a good, and that doesn't get the attention it deserves. We tend to think of Taiwan as the main piece of the chain, whereas any part of it can be breached. And you've got really a similar problem. And the Chinese also are very interested in getting through the Philippines. At the moment, we've got things are going pretty well for the Philippines and for us in terms of defensive operations. The President Marcos is very serious about defense, and we've never been doing more. And one of the real advantages is the Americans have been treating the and others have been treating the Filipinos like equals. So the Philippines actually gets a lot out of the training. They're getting a lot of equipment, and we've been able, the free world, the Americans and others, Australians, etc., have been able to establish a much better relationship with defense capabilities to operate, really to actually defend both the Philippines, but also reach up into the Taiwan Strait and also influence events around Taiwan. So it's going pretty well, but keep in mind that in the Philippines, it's like a pendulum. And Marcos is very strong on defending against China. His predecessor, Duterte, was believed to be receiving some cash from the Chinese in different ways, and he was much more accommodating. And then he sort of shifted a little bit, but it was sort of the other extreme. And before him, you had Aquino, and he was saying, look, what's happening to us? This is the Sudetenland. We're getting bullied. You guys had better wake up. But the Philippines actually looks better than it's been, and they're buying just in their own right. They're bought BrahMos anti-ship missiles from the Indians. They're probably going to get some similar missiles from the Japanese. And the Japanese are actually paying very close attention to the Philippines and have been for about 15 years. They've done it quietly. And they have provided patrol vessels, coastal radars. They've worked on dual use infrastructure, ports and airfields that obviously have a use. And they've been doing that for a long time. The Japanese army just showed up for the Balikatan exercise this last time. It must have been 1,400 people. And that was the first time that had ever happened. And, so much for the remnants of the resentments of World War II. But the Japanese are doing this with Taiwan in mind, with China in mind. And also notice that nobody in Japan is complaining about this. So that's a big deal. And when it comes to the Philippines, however, you do have huge problems with, once again, Chinese subversion, political warfare, and it's all aided by, it's a pretty corrupt place. The economy is not what it should be, and poverty is immense, and it allows openings. And the Chinese have been bullying the Filipinos, particularly trying to occupy and take their maritime territory. And with some success, the Filipinos have, however, been fighting back as much as they can. And I think they're sort of waiting for the Americans to actually get out to the sharp end and help them if they can. And this started, you saw it in 2012, the real start of it, when the Chinese moved in on Scarborough Shoal, which is in Philippine territory, and the Philippines went out. The Americans cut a deal or negotiated a settlement, and both sides agreed to pull back. The Filipinos did. The Chinese did not. The Chinese have never left, really, and now they're going to build things on Scarborough Shoal. And then this was 2012 when this incident happened, and a few years later, the Americans convinced the Filipinos to bring a suit against at the one of the international courts, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and the Filipinos did. They won overwhelmingly, which never happens, and they won. And the American administration, the Obama administration, basically did nothing. They sent a couple officials to China shortly afterwards, and they didn't even mention the decision. And the Chinese declared it was just a piece of scrap paper. So the Filipino relationship with the Americans, it's got some friction in it, and there are Filipinos who still resent this. Make no mistake about it. But for now, we've got it looks okay in the Philippines. So that part of the chain, for now, it seems to be solid enough. And the Chinese, I think, are not very happy with Marcos at all, and they would like to have him get replaced by somebody more pliant. Now, if you just go down the chain a little bit farther, Indonesia, we'll get to the bottom of it. Next slide, please. Let's see what we have here. I've sort of forgot. Okay. Well, go back a couple, if you will. Okay. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, keep going. Okay, that's good. Okay, now you see, well, below the Philippines, you have Malaysia and Indonesia. I'll go over these very quickly. Malaysia, as I said, has got sort of a mixed, their relationship with the Chinese is, it's mixed. And they do get the elites get a lot of money from the Chinese, but they're not going to entirely roll over, at least. And not least, most regular Malays don't really have much love for the Chinese. But Indonesia's in the mix as well, because Borneo most of it's Indonesian. And they really have no great love for the PRC, although they're willing to do business, they're willing to take money, but it only goes so far. And the Indonesians have a very good relationship with the Japanese. They're probably going to either buy or accept some Japanese naval ships, in the not too distant future. And the Japanese military, the army has trained down there. In fact, having flown all the way from Japan and dropped paratroopers as part of an exercise in Indonesia not all that long ago. And recently the Indonesians signed a defense sort of agreement with the Americans. So that's sort of the southern end of the chain, and it's got some. So it's solid enough. If you know, it could be better, but it's not too bad. And there's a few other things down there worth considering. Is Singapore. It has a U.S. presence where it lets us use one of their naval bases and do some other things. But when the missiles start flying, it's not clear what exactly Singapore will do. But just the other day, as I mentioned, the Prime Minister of Singapore said, we welcome the Japanese playing a bigger role. The Singapore military has been training in Taiwan for about 50 years. They do it quietly. And the Chinese know it and usually don't make too much of a deal out of it. And also as part of the ends of the chain actually do matter a bit. And there's Australia. It's by and large, I think it would like a solid first island chain. But its military is very small. It's only about 50,000. Its navy has about 11 ships in it, and it's got a lot of territory to cover. But it also still thinks it's going to thread the needle and keep doing a lot of business with China, while being a security partner to the US and the other free nations. So that it's not quite what it seems with Australia, but also they've have built a nice relationship with the Japanese, and both sides want that to get stronger. But so you do have to look at the ends of the chain. Now, please go to the next slides. Keep going, please. Just keep going, please. Now, okay, next one. Okay, now the Chinese, you can see that they look at the first island chain and they sort of, they still have trouble. But also they've already leapfrogged it in a certain respect. And that's part of their strategy is, you've got the first island chain, but if we're already behind it, well, what are you going to do about it? And that is what they've been doing. Next slide. Okay, next slide. And also this area is the one the Americans think they're going to be able to fight through. These are just the red is some of the places, actually there's the blue places too. They all have a Chinese presence and Chinese influence. And it is shifting a lot, some of these places away from, say, the United States, away from the West and into China's camp, or at least making it more neutral, which if you're counting on that as your secure rear area, if you're the US defending the first island chain, you could see the problems. And it's a common sequence that we've seen play out over the years. And it starts with a Chinese presence, usually Chinese people running little shops. And it's a commercial presence. Then it can be into timber, fishing, mining, etc. And that leads to political influence. And particularly it builds a constituency that is basically sees China as the better bet. And all of this is greased with by payments and sort of these under the table benefits. And the Chinese are very good at doing this, but as I say, it's a sequence that you see played out. You've seen it play out in the United States over the last 30 years, just manifests itself a little bit differently. And there's always a security angle at the end, particularly at this part. And the next slide. And that's how we're going to do this. So, well, the Americans have kind of woken up to this. And they've, doing things like refurbishing runways on Tinian up in the Northern Marianas, where there's a huge Chinese presence. And next slide. And the Chinese are there, influencing. There's the guys building casinos right on the port in Tinian, where the construction equipment comes in to rebuild the airfields. And this is just one example of something like a million. Next slide. And the Solomon Islands, it's well outside the first island chain. It's up to the northeast of Australia. In 2022, they reached a deal this is simplifying it, with the Chinese, and it potentially allows the Chinese military to come in to the Solomon Islands. And the Chinese had tried to actually buy the island of Tulagi in the Solomons to make a naval base out of it not long before that. So say that's part of that sequence. Next slide. That goes, you could see presence, commercial influence, political influence with a security angle to it. And so when you think of the first island of chain defense, you have to realize the Chinese are already behind it and influencing and sort of digging in some of these places. And I'm not sure that on the U.S. side that we quite understand this. In some places they do, but in terms of our overall strategy, I'm not quite convinced of that. And really, as a practical matter, I would say that the president of any Chinese timber company or fishing company on a Pacific island probably has more influence than Admiral Sam Paparo at Indo-PACOM. The reason being, he's there all the time. He gets to know people, and he gets to influence. The Very briefly, as I get asked, it's important. Could the Chinese actually break through the first island chain? Is their military powerful enough to do it? I think they. I'm not sure. It depends, but it depends. And in some respects, you don't even have to if you do the political warfare right. But it has developed into a military that needs to be taken very seriously. Next slide. And I won't get into this right now. I want to have more questions and more discussion. But the Chinese can really only power project about 1,000 miles off the coast for now, in the sense that they could really sort of deliver some oomph. But they're able to grab just about anything they want to if they're not stopped from doing it. But it has developed into a military that needs to be taken very seriously. And the military's only got to be able to do a certain thing at a certain place at a certain time, as the Argentinians showed in the Falklands. And the PLA, unfortunately, is capable of doing that. Certainly, the closer to the Chinese mainland, the more capable they are of it. Next slide. And very quickly, just gives you the graphic gives you a sense of how they have developed. And around 2,000 people laughed about the Chinese military. They don't so much anymore. Next slide. And for good reason. I think you can see why. I think that tells you about everything that you need to know in terms of the development of the Chinese military and its growth. Next slide. Yeah, we can talk about this later. And next one. Okay. Well, that is very quickly running through the first island chain, trying to give you a sense of things on the ground and sort of how I see it. And you'll notice I didn't mention South Korea, some that's usually not in the chain, but it is part of the part of the equation from our perspective and in China's perspective. So all in all, I think we certainly have the basis for a solid defense of the first island chain, assuming that we help these countries develop their militaries as they should, but also doing the political warfare part of it. And I think that we have some reasonable prospects if we keep our wits about us. But we do have to also get the rear area under control as well, and there's opportunity to excel there. So we've got some work to do. So is it steel or Gossamer? Yeah, I'd say it's more. Well, right now I'd say it's at least pig iron, or it's strong enough for now. But those things can change very quickly, and if you ever think it's locked in, trouble's coming. So anyway, very quickly, I just ran through it. So I appreciate the opportunity and welcome to have a discussion.